3 women, 1 red-eye flight, a layover in a city where dreams go to die. They checked into their hotel rooms at 11:47 p.m. on September the 15th, 1996. By morning, their beds were still made, their suitcases unopened, and their uniforms hanging pristine in the closets. Security footage shows them entering the elevator together, laughing, alive. But the cameras on the 3rd floor? They had mysteriously malfunctioned that night. For 28 years, their families have lived with a question that has no answer. Until now. Until a construction crew tore down the wrong wall in that same hotel and found something that should have stayed buried forever. If you're drawn to mysteries that refuse to let go, stories that crawl under your skin and stay there, subscribe now. The Desert Rose Hotel stood like a tombstone against the Las Vegas skyline, its pink Art Deco facade faded to the color of old bone. For 43 years, it had welcomed gamblers, honeymooners, and transient souls seeking reinvention in the neon wilderness. Now, in the autumn of 2024, it awaited demolition. Raymond Torres had worked construction for 30 years, but he had never felt the particular coldness that emanated from behind the wall on the 3rd floor's eastern corridor. His crew had been gutting the building room by room, stripping it down to studs and concrete, when his sledgehammer broke through the dry wall of room 317 and met not insulation, but empty space. The flashlight beam cut through decades of darkness, illuminating what had been hidden since the hotel's renovation in 1997. Raymond's breath caught in his throat. He took an involuntary step backward, his boot crunching on broken plaster, and pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands. When Detective Sarah Chen arrived an hour later, the corridor was already sealed with yellow tape. She had been with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department for 15 years, the last 7 in cold cases. She recognized the expression on Raymond's face, the particular shade of pale that came from seeing something fundamentally wrong. Inside the sealed space, barely 4 feet wide and running the length of what had once been 3 separate hotel rooms, the air was thick with dust, and the unmistakable smell of decay long settled into silence. 3 sets of women's clothing lay arranged on the concrete floor with disturbing precision. 3 pairs of shoes, lined up as if their owners had simply stepped out of them. 3 purses, their contents still intact, and 3 employee identification badges from Western Airways. The faces in the photographs young and smiling, frozen in a time before the world forgot them. Sarah knelt beside the first badge, her gloved hand trembling slightly as she read the name. Jessica Hartman. She knew that name. Every detective in the department knew that name. It was legend, cautionary tale. The case that haunted the old-timers who had worked it fresh, before the trail went cold and the file gathered dust in the basement archives. September 15th, 1996. 3 flight attendants checked into the Desert Rose Hotel for a standard layover. By morning, they had vanished completely, as if they had never existed at all. No bodies, no witnesses, no leads. Just 3 empty rooms and a mystery that consumed investigators for years before being reluctantly shelved. Now, 28 years later, Sarah stood in a space that shouldn't exist, staring at evidence that should have been found decades ago, and felt the weight of all those lost years pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. This wasn't just a cold case warming up. This was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting, patient and terrible, for someone to finally look in the right place. She pulled out her phone and dialed her partner. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the ice in her veins. "You need to get down to the Desert Rose Hotel and call the families. After 28 years, we finally found them." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew that finding them was only the beginning. The real question, the one that would keep her awake for months to come, was far more disturbing. If their belongings had been here all along, sealed behind a wall that was built just months after they disappeared, Then where were the bodies? And who had known exactly where to hide the evidence of 3 women who had simply ceased to exist? The photograph on Sarah Chen's desk was grainy, printed from a newspaper archive that had been digitized years after the fact. 3 women stood together in front of a Western Airways aircraft, their navy blue uniforms crisp, their smiles bright with a particular optimism of people who believed the world was larger than their small corners of it. Jessica Hartman, 26, from Sacramento. Blonde hair pulled back in the regulation style, green eyes that seemed to hold some private amusement. She had been flying for Western Airways for 3 years, had an apartment she shared with 2 roommates, and a boyfriend who had been planning to propose on her next day off. Denise Moreau, 31, from New Orleans. The oldest of the 3, with dark hair and an elegant composure that suggested she had seen more of life than her companions. She sent money home to her mother every month and had logged more flight hours than anyone else in her training class. Kimberly Tate, 24, from Phoenix. Red hair, freckles, a smile that reached her eyes. The newest hire, just 8 months into her career, still excited by every city, every sunrise seen from altitude, every small adventure that came with a job that kept her perpetually in motion. Sarah had read their files so many times over the past 3 days that she could recite the details without looking. But reading about them and understanding them were different things entirely. She needed to know who they were before she could understand what had happened to them. The original case file was 4 inches thick, a testament to how thoroughly the 1996 investigation had been conducted. Detective William Russo had been the lead, and his notes were meticulous. Sarah had called him 2 days ago, tracked him down to a retirement community in Henderson where he spent his days playing cards and trying not to think about the cases that had never closed. He had agreed to meet her at a diner off the Strip, away from the tourists and the noise. Now, sitting across from him in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, Sarah watched him stir his coffee with the kind of methodical attention that came from needing to do something with his hands. 28 years, he said finally, his voice rough with age and cigarettes he'd quit a decade too late. I worked that case until my captain pulled me off. Worked it on my own time after that. Never could let it go. Walk me through it, Sarah said gently. From the beginning. William Russo's eyes focused on something beyond the diner window, seeing not the present-day traffic, but a September night in 1996. Flight 447 from Chicago landed at McCarran at 10:23 p.m. The crew had a standard layover, scheduled to fly out again at 9:15 the next morning. Western Airways always put their crews up at the Desert Rose. It was close to the airport, affordable, and they had a corporate rate. He pulled out a worn notebook, the pages yellowed and soft from handling. The 3 of them took a cab together from the airport. Security footage showed them arriving at the hotel at 11:47 p.m. They checked in at the front desk. Jessica paid for a bottle of wine from the gift shop, and they got on the elevator. That's the last time anyone saw them. Sarah leaned forward. The elevator? Yeah. The footage shows them getting on, pushing the button for the 3rd floor. All 3 of them were laughing about something. They looked tired but happy. Normal. The elevator goes up, the doors open on 3, and that's where the footage cuts out. The camera's on the 3rd floor. Malfunctioned, William said, his voice heavy with frustration that hadn't dimmed over nearly 3 decades. Every single camera on that floor went dark at 11:53 p.m. The hotel claimed it was a technical glitch, some kind of power surge. They came back online at 1:17 a.m. By then, the hallway was empty. Sarah made notes, even though she had read all of this before. Sometimes hearing it spoken aloud revealed details that looked different on paper. Their rooms. 317, 319, and 321. 3 rooms in a row on the east corridor. When the maid service tried to clean them the next morning, they found the rooms untouched. Beds still made. Luggage by the door, still zipped. Bathroom amenities unused. It was like they had never entered the rooms at all. But their key cards had been used. William nodded. All 3 room locks registered entry at 11:55 p.m. Someone opened those doors. The hotel system logged it. Someone, Sarah repeated. Not necessarily them. That's what kept me up nights. William took a long drink of his coffee. Their family started calling when they didn't show up for their flight. Western Airways contacted us around noon when they realized 3 crew members had simply vanished. We had uniforms at the Desert Rose within an hour. He paused, his jaw tightening. We searched that hotel top to bottom. Every room, every closet, every maintenance space. We interviewed every guest who had checked in that night, every employee who had been on duty. We pulled records for every person who had stayed there in the previous month. We did everything right, Detective Chen. Everything. Sarah heard the pain in his voice, the guilt that came from doing everything right and still failing. I know you did. We even brought in cadaver dogs. They hit on nothing. It was like those 3 women just evaporated the moment they stepped off that elevator. Sarah pulled out a photograph from her folder, one taken 3 days ago in the hidden space behind the wall. The renovation, she said. When did that happen? William's face darkened. May 1997, 8 months after the disappearances. The hotel changed ownership. New management wanted to modernize. They reconfigured the entire 3rd floor, changed the room layouts, updated everything. And you investigated the renovation? As much as I could. But by then, the case was already going cold. The new owners were cooperative, let us examine the construction plans, interview the workers. Nothing stood out. It seemed legitimate. He looked at the photograph, his expression haunted. I never thought to look inside the walls themselves. Sarah could hear what he wasn't saying. None of them had. The investigation had been thorough but conventional. They had searched for bodies, for evidence, for witnesses. They had never imagined that someone had built a hiding place right under their noses, sealed evidence away behind fresh drywall and paint, knowing that in a renovated hotel, no one would think to tear the walls apart. The families, Sarah said quietly. How did they handle it? William's hands tightened around his coffee cup. About how you'd expect. Jessica's boyfriend, David Richmond, he took it the hardest. Blamed himself for not going with her on the trip, for not being there to protect her. Last I heard, he never got over it. Never married. Denise's mother died 5 years ago, never knowing what happened to her daughter. And Kimberly's parents, they hired private investigators, spent their retirement savings trying to find her. It destroyed them. Sarah filed all of this away, building a picture not just of the victims, but of the devastation they had left behind. 3 women, 3 families, 3 circles of grief that had radiated outward for 28 years. Tell me about the hotel itself, she said. Was there anything unusual about it? Any history? William hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sarah sensed something he hadn't put in the reports. The Desert Rose had a reputation, he said finally. Nothing official, just rumors. Stories about guests disappearing, though never anything confirmed. It had been around since the 80s, and Vegas being Vegas, people come here to vanish all the time. Run from debts, from marriages, from lives they don't want anymore. But there was something about that place. He met her eyes. Staff turnover was unusually high. People would work there for a few months and quit. When we interviewed them during the investigation, some of them mentioned feeling uncomfortable, bad dreams, a sense of being watched. But nothing concrete. Nothing you could build a case on. Just feelings. Sarah closed her notebook. She had what she needed for now, though she knew she would call William again. He had lived with this case for nearly 3 decades. He knew things that weren't in the files, things that only came from obsession and sleepless nights spent chasing ghosts. As she stood to leave, William reached out and caught her arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for a man his age. "Detective Chen," he said, his voice low and urgent. "When you find out what happened to those women, when you find out who did this, promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't let this case do to you what it did to me. Promise me you'll know when to stop, when to walk away. Because this thing, Whatever it is, it doesn't want to be solved. Some darkness should stay buried. Sarah looked at him, at the haunted eyes and the trembling hands, at a man who had given years of his life to 3 women he had never met, and nodded. But even as she made the promise, she knew it was one she wouldn't keep. The evidence room in the basement of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department smelled of dust and old paper, of years compressed into cardboard boxes and manila folders. Sarah stood in front of the shelf holding the Western Airways Flight 447 case materials, 3 boxes that represented thousands of hours of investigation and 28 years of silence. Marcus Webb, her partner for the past 2 years, set down 2 cups of coffee and stared at the boxes like they might bite. "I was in middle school when this happened," he said. "Feels weird working a case older than my career." "Every cold case starts somewhere," Sarah replied, pulling down the first box. "The question is whether we're looking at the same evidence with new eyes, or whether we're looking for something that wasn't there before." They spent the next 4 hours going through every document, every photograph, every witness statement. The work was tedious but necessary. Sarah had learned that cold cases weren't solved by sudden revelations or brilliant deductions. They were solved by patience, by grinding through details until something that hadn't made sense before suddenly clicked into place. The witness statements were particularly revealing, not for what they said, but for what they avoided saying. The night clerk who had checked in the 3 flight attendants, a man named Robert Paulson, had been interviewed twice. His statements were consistent but oddly flat, describing the women as pleasant and unremarkable, their transaction routine. But reading between the lines, Sarah noticed that he had quit his job at the Desert Rose 2 weeks after the disappearances. "Marcus," she said, highlighting the detail. "Find out where Robert Paulson is now. I want to talk to him." Her partner made a note, then held up a photograph from the evidence box. "Look at this. Crime scene photo from room 317, Jessica Hartman's room." Sarah took the photograph, studying it carefully. The room looked untouched, almost staged in its perfection. The bed was made with hospital corners, the pillows fluffed and centered. The luggage sat precisely parallel to the wall. Even the television remote was aligned perfectly on the nightstand. "Too perfect," Sarah murmured, "like someone cleaned it." "That's what I thought." But the maid service swore they hadn't entered the room yet. These photos were taken before housekeeping got there. Sarah set the photo aside and pulled out the images from the other 2 rooms. They were identical. The same eerie perfection. The same sense that these rooms had been prepared, arranged, staged for discovery. "Someone wanted us to find these rooms like this," she said. "The question is why." They continued working through the evidence until Marcus's phone rang. He listened for a moment, his expression growing serious, then thanked whoever was on the other end and hung up. "That was the crime lab," he said. "They finished processing the evidence from behind the wall." Sarah looked up, her pulse quickening, and the clothing all belonged to the 3 victims. They confirmed it through the name tags and laundry marks. The purses contained their wallets, identification, credit cards, some cash. Everything you'd expect. But there's something else. He paused, and Sarah could see he was choosing his words carefully. "They found hair in the purses. Long strands, different colors. They're running DNA now, but the preliminary assessment is that the hair was deliberately placed there." "Deliberately placed," Sarah repeated. "You mean someone collected it and put it in the purses?" "That's what it looks like. And there's more. They found fingernail clippings in the pockets of the uniforms." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just evidence being hidden. This was evidence being collected, preserved, arranged like trophies. "He kept parts of them." Marcus nodded grimly. Whoever did this, he wanted to remember them. And he was confident enough that he'd never be caught that he sealed his collection right there in the wall, knowing that even if the hotel was searched, no one would think to look inside the actual structure. Sarah stood and walked to the whiteboard she had set up in the corner of the evidence room. She wrote 3 names at the top: Jessica Hartman, Denise Moreau, Kimberly Tate. Below them, she began adding what they knew. Disappeared, September 15th, 1996, between 11:53 p.m. and 1:17 a.m. Last seen, entering elevator at Desert Rose Hotel, laughing and apparently at ease. Evidence found: clothing, purses, identification, hair, fingernail clippings, sealed in wall constructed during May 1997 renovation. Bodies not found. Marcus joined her at the board, adding his own observations. The renovation, he said. That's key. Whoever sealed this evidence in the wall had access to the construction site. They knew the renovation plans, knew exactly where to hide everything. And they had 8 months to plan it, Sarah added. From September to May. 8 months to figure out the perfect hiding spot, to wait for the right moment, to seal away their crime where no one would find it. Unless the hotel came down, Marcus said quietly, which almost didn't happen. The Desert Rose was supposed to be demolished 5 years ago. The project got delayed, then delayed again. If Raymond Torres hadn't broken through that wall, this evidence might have been crushed into rubble and hauled away without anyone ever knowing it existed. Sarah stared at the board, at the 3 names that represented 3 lives cut short, 3 families destroyed, 3 mysteries that had haunted a city for nearly 3 decades. We need to build a timeline of the renovation, she said. Every worker, every contractor, every person who had access to that floor during construction. And we need to find out who owned the hotel at the time, who approved the renovation plans, who had the authority to change the layout. Her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her stomach drop. The message was from the medical examiner's office. Just 3 words. You need to see this. 20 minutes later, Sarah and Marcus stood in the sterile examination room of the Clark County Coroner's office. Dr. Patricia Yun, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of steady hands that came from years of working with the dead, gestured them over to a stainless steel table. On the table were 3 pairs of shoes, the ones that had been found lined up so precisely in the hidden space. They looked ordinary, standard-issue black pumps that matched the Western Airways uniform requirements. But Dr. Yun's expression suggested they were anything but ordinary. I almost missed it, she said, picking up the first shoe with gloved hands. It's only visible under certain lighting conditions. She angled the shoe toward an ultraviolet lamp, and suddenly Sarah could see what she meant. The inside of the shoe was covered in dark brown stains, invisible to the naked eye, but glowing faintly under the UV light. Blood, Dr. Yun confirmed. All 3 pairs of shoes have the same staining pattern. The blood is on the insoles, concentrated at the toe area and along the sides. Marcus leaned closer. So they were wearing the shoes when they were killed. More than that, Dr. Yun said. Look at the pattern. This isn't spatter or transfer. This is sustained contact, the kind you get from someone standing in their own blood for an extended period. Sarah felt her throat tighten. Extended period. How long? Long enough for the blood to seep through their stockings, through the leather, to stain the insoles. We're talking minutes, maybe longer. Dr. Yun set the shoe down carefully. These women were alive and standing after they started bleeding. Whatever happened to them, it wasn't quick. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. Sarah forced herself to think past the horror, to focus on what this evidence meant. Can you extract DNA from the blood? We're trying, but it's degraded after 28 years. We might get partial profiles, enough to confirm the blood belonged to the victims, but probably not enough to identify anyone else who might have been there. What about the hair and fingernail clippings? Dr. Yun moved to a different table where evidence bags were laid out in neat rows. Those are in much better condition. The hair follicles are intact on several strands, which means they were pulled out rather than cut or fallen naturally. The fingernails were clipped cleanly, probably with standard nail clippers. We're running DNA on everything, comparing it to the genetic profiles we got from the victims' families. How long until we have results? 3 to 5 days for the preliminary analysis. Longer if we need more detailed comparison. Sarah made notes, her mind already racing ahead to the next steps. They needed to find Robert Paulson, the night clerk. They needed the renovation records from the Desert Rose. They needed to track down every person who had worked at that hotel in 1996 and 1997. Most urgently, they needed to find where the bodies were buried. Because one thing was now certain. Jessica Hartman, Denise Moreau, and Kimberly Tate hadn't simply vanished. They had been murdered in that hotel, their blood soaking into their shoes as they stood helpless, their hair and nails collected like specimens, their belongings sealed away as monuments to whoever had destroyed them. The Desert Rose Hotel had secrets in its bones, and Sarah Chen was going to tear it apart until every one of them was exposed to the light. Robert Paulson lived in a trailer park on the outskirts of North Las Vegas, where the desert reclaimed everything that wasn't constantly defended against it. Sarah and Marcus pulled up to a rusted airstream that looked like it had been there since the trailer park's inception, surrounded by dead grass and a chain-link fence that served no apparent purpose. The man who answered their knock was in his early 60s, with the kind of weathered face that came from hard living and harder memories. His eyes went immediately to their badges, and something in his expression shifted, becoming both resigned and relieved, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 28 years. "I wondered when someone would come," he said, his voice hoarse. He didn't ask why they were there. He simply stepped aside and let them in. The interior of the trailer was surprisingly neat, everything in its place, but the air held the stale smell of cigarettes and isolation. Robert gestured to a worn couch and took a seat himself in a recliner that faced a television showing a muted news broadcast. "You worked the night shift at the Desert Rose Hotel," Sarah began, but Robert held up a hand to stop her. "September 15th, 1996, he said. "I checked in 3 flight attendants at 11:47 p.m. By morning, they were gone. I've lived with that night every day since." Marcus pulled out his notebook. "Then you know why we're here. The hotel is being demolished. We found evidence." Robert's hands began to shake. He clasped them together in his lap, but Sarah could still see the tremor. "What kind of evidence?" "Their belongings, sealed in a wall that was constructed during the 1997 renovation." Sarah kept her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Paulson, your original statement said you saw nothing unusual that night, that the women checked in normally, went to their rooms, and you never saw them again." "That's true. But you quit 2 weeks later. Why?" Robert was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the muted television where images of the Las Vegas Strip flickered past. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I knew something was wrong with that place. I'd known it for months before those women disappeared. But I was broke, needed the money, and night shifts at the Desert Rose paid better than anywhere else. You know why they paid better? Because no one wanted to work there after dark." Sarah leaned forward. "Tell us what you experienced." "The sounds," Robert said. "That's what got to me first. The elevator would run at night even when no one called it. I'd hear it going up and down, the cables groaning. I'd check the security monitors and see the car was empty, but it kept moving anyway. And the 3rd floor, that floor was always cold. Even in the middle of summer, even with the AC off, stepping onto that floor was like walking into a freezer." "Did you report this to management?" Robert laughed bitterly. "To Ray Carver, the man who owned the place. He knew. Everyone who worked there knew. But Carver didn't care as long as the hotel made money, and it did. Vegas was booming in the 90s. People came, they gambled, they left. No one stayed long enough to notice the wrongness." Marcus made a note. "Ray Carver. He was the owner in 1996. Since 1989. He bought the Desert Rose from the original owners, said he was going to restore it to its former glory. But all he did was paint over the decay and charge tourist prices. "Where is he now?" Sarah asked. "Dead. Heart attack in 2003. His son inherited the property, tried to keep it running for a few more years, then sold it to some investment group." Robert rubbed his face with both hands. "That night, the night those women disappeared, I remember thinking they seemed nervous when they checked in. Not scared exactly, but on edge, like they could feel it too." "Feel what?" "That something was watching." Robert met Sarah's eyes, and she saw genuine fear there, old and deep. "The hotel had a presence. I know how that sounds, Detective. I know you deal in facts and evidence, but I'm telling you there was something wrong with that building. It was hungry." Sarah maintained her composure, though a chill ran down her spine. "Did you see anyone else in the lobby that night? Any other guests? Any staff members?" "Just me at the desk. The maintenance man, Eddie Frakes. He was supposed to be on duty, but I didn't see him most of the shift. He had a habit of disappearing into the basement, claimed he was checking the boilers, but everyone knew he was sleeping off whatever he'd been drinking." "Eddie Frakes," Marcus repeated, writing the name down. "Is he still alive?" "Last I heard, he was in a care facility. Had a stroke a few years back. I don't know if he can still talk." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Robert a photograph of the hidden space behind the wall, the clothing arranged so carefully on the concrete floor. "Mr. Paulson, during the renovation in 1997, did you return to the hotel at all? Did you see the construction work?" Robert stared at the photograph, his face going pale. "I went by once, maybe 3 months into the renovation. I had some belongings in my old locker I needed to get. The 3rd floor was torn apart, walls opened up, wiring exposed. There were workers everywhere." He paused, his breath becoming shallow. "I remember thinking it looked like someone had performed surgery on the building, like they were cutting out its organs." "Did you see anything that seemed unusual? Anyone who shouldn't have been there?" "There was a man," Robert said slowly, as if pulling the memory from deep storage. "I didn't recognize him from the regular crew. He was in the 3rd floor corridor, standing alone, just staring at the walls. He had dark hair, maybe in his 40s, wearing a maintenance uniform, but it didn't fit right. Too new, too clean. When he saw me, he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A smile like he knew something I didn't." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Can you describe him more specifically?" "Tall, maybe 6 feet. Thin build. His eyes, I remember his eyes were very dark, almost black. And his hands, they were stained with something. I thought it was paint or grease, but the color was wrong. It was reddish-brown. The same color as dried blood," Sarah thought but didn't say. "Did you tell the police about this man during the original investigation?" Robert shook his head. "I didn't see him until months later, during the renovation. And by then, the investigation had gone cold. I thought about calling it in, but what would I have said? That I saw a man who smiled wrong and had dirty hands. It wasn't evidence, but it was," Sarah realized. It was a piece of the puzzle that had been missing for 28 years. Someone had been at that hotel during the renovation, someone who had access to the construction site, someone who had looked at the exposed walls and seen an opportunity. As they prepared to leave, Robert reached out and caught Sarah's arm, just as William Russo had done. "Detective," he said urgently, "whatever you find in that hotel, whatever happened to those women, be careful. I told you the building was hungry, but it was hungry because something fed it, something human." Outside, in the harsh sunlight that seemed too bright after the dimness of the trailer, Marcus turned to Sarah. "You think he's reliable? The stuff about the hotel being hungry, that's pretty out there." "Trauma does strange things to memory," Sarah said, but she was thinking about the shoes with blood on the insoles, about hair and fingernails carefully collected and preserved, about 3 women who had stood bleeding while something terrible was done to them. But underneath the supernatural language, he's describing something real. Fear, A predator who knew how to use that building to his advantage. Her phone rang. It was the lab. "Detective Chen," the technician said without preamble. "You need to come back. We found something in one of the purses, something that changes everything." Sarah's hands tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "Photographs," the technician said. "Polaroids, hidden in a false bottom of one of the wallets." "Detective, these photos were taken after the women disappeared." The photographs were spread across the examination table in the evidence room like a deck of terrible cards. Sarah stood over them, forcing herself to look at each one, to catalog every detail, even as her stomach twisted with revulsion. There were 12 Polaroids in total. Their colors slightly faded, but the images sickeningly clear. They showed portions of the third-floor corridor at the Desert Rose Hotel, the same corridor where the women had last been seen. But these photos hadn't been taken during normal operations. The hallway was dark, except for a few emergency lights. And in each frame, there was a presence just at the edge of visibility, a figure partially obscured by shadow. Dr. Yun, who had called them in, pointed to the first photograph with a gloved finger. "Look at the timestamp on the Polaroid's border, September 16th, 1996, 2:34 a.m. Hours after the women had vanished. Hours after the security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned and then restored themselves. Marcus picked up another photo, this one showing a doorway. Room 319. Denise Moreau's assigned room. The door was partially open, and through the gap, something was visible on the floor. Something that might have been fabric or might have been something else entirely. "These were in Jessica Hartman's wallet," Dr. Yun continued, "tucked into a hidden compartment behind the card slots. Whoever put them there knew they'd be found eventually, but only by someone who looked carefully." Sarah studied each photograph, her trained eye picking apart the composition, the angles, the deliberate staging of each shot. These weren't taken randomly. This is documentation. He was recording what he'd done. "But why put them in the victim's wallet?" Marcus asked. "Why not keep them as trophies separately?" "Because he wanted them to be part of the evidence," Sarah said slowly, the realization chilling her. "He wanted whoever found this hiding place to see exactly what he was capable of. This isn't just a killer covering his tracks. This is someone who believed he'd created the perfect crime, and he wanted to document his genius." She picked up the last photograph, and her breath caught. This one was different from the others. It showed a section of wall in the third-floor corridor, the drywall removed to expose the wooden studs and empty space behind. And arranged carefully in that space, barely visible in the photograph's dim lighting, were what appeared to be 3 sets of clothing. "He took this during the renovation," Sarah said. "He came back 8 months later, sealed their belongings in the wall, and photographed it. This is his signature, his way of signing his work." Dr. Yun pulled out a magnifying glass and held it over one of the photos. "There's something else. Look at this one, the shot of the corridor. In the reflection on the window at the end of the hall, you can see a figure. It's distorted by the glass and the poor lighting, but it's there." Sarah leaned in, her eyes straining to make out the details. The figure was tall and thin, exactly matching Robert Paulson's description of the man he'd seen during the renovation. But more than that, the figure appeared to be holding something. A camera, Sarah realized. He was photographing his own reflection. "Can we enhance this?" Marcus asked. "Maybe get facial recognition on it?" "The photo quality is too poor," Dr. Yun said. "And it's been nearly 3 decades, but our imaging department is working on it. If there's anything there, they'll find it." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from one of the junior detectives on her team. They had located Eddie Frakes, the maintenance man who had worked at the Desert Rose the night of the disappearances. He was in a long-term care facility in Henderson, and while he had limited mobility from his stroke, his cognitive function was reportedly intact. He had agreed to see them. The Sunrise Care Center was a low-slung building that tried to disguise its institutional nature with pastel colors and potted plants. Eddie Frakes was in a wheelchair in the common room. A thin man in his 70s with one side of his face slightly drooping from the stroke. But his eyes were alert, and when Sarah introduced herself and Marcus, she saw recognition flash across his features. "The flight attendants," he said, his words slightly slurred but understandable. "I knew someone would come eventually. I knew those women never left that hotel. They moved to a quiet corner where they could talk privately." Eddie's hands trembled in his lap, not from palsy, but from something deeper, something that had been eating at him for years. "Mr. Frakes," Sarah began, "you were on duty the night of September 15th, 1996, but you told the original investigators you didn't see or hear anything unusual." "I lied," Eddie said simply. "Not about not seeing them. I never saw those women. But I heard things that night, things that made me hide in the basement until my shift ended." "What kind of things?" Eddie closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Screaming. From the 3rd floor. It started around midnight, maybe a little after. Not loud screaming, not the kind you hear in a horror movie. This was muffled, like it was coming from behind walls or under blankets. I was in the basement checking the boilers when I heard it through the ventilation system." Sarah felt her skin prickle. "Why didn't you investigate?" "Because I was a coward," Eddie said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "And because I knew that if I went up there, if I saw what was making those sounds, I'd either end up dead or I'd spend the rest of my life wishing I was. So I stayed in the basement. I drank the bottle I kept hidden behind the water heater, and I stayed down there until the screaming stopped." "When did it stop?" "Around 1 in the morning, maybe a little after. Then there was silence. Complete silence. Even the building sounds stopped, the creaking and settling you always hear in old hotels. It was like the whole place was holding its breath." Marcus leaned forward. "Did you see anyone else in the hotel that night? Any guests? Any visitors?" Eddie shook his head. "The lobby was dead. We only had maybe 6 rooms occupied that night. The Desert Rose wasn't exactly a hot destination even back then, but there was someone in the building. Someone who didn't check in through the front desk." "How do you know?" "Because I found the access door to the maintenance tunnels propped open the next morning. The door that led from the basement to the 3rd floor service corridor. I always kept that door locked because the tunnels weren't safe. The wiring was old and exposed. But someone had used a brick to prop it open." Sarah's mind raced. The maintenance tunnels would have provided access to the 3rd floor without using the main elevator or stairwells, without appearing on any security cameras. "Did you tell the police about this?" "I tried, but I was drunk most of the time back then, and I had a record for petty theft. The detective who interviewed me, he wrote down what I said, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Thought I was just trying to cover my own ass for not being at my post." Eddie reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a key, old and tarnished with age. "This is the key to the maintenance tunnels. I kept it all these years. Figured someday it might matter. The tunnels are still there, underneath the hotel. They were part of the original structure. Even the renovation didn't touch them." Sarah took the key, feeling its weight in her palm. "Mr. Frakes, the man who used these tunnels, did you ever see him? Ever get a look at him?" "Once," Eddie said, and his expression became haunted. "About a week before those women disappeared. I was working late, replacing some pipes in the basement, when I heard footsteps in the tunnel. I looked up and saw a man standing in the shadows, just watching me. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there watching with these dark, dead eyes. After maybe 30 seconds, he turned and walked back into the tunnel. I never saw where he went." "Can you describe him?" "Tall, thin, dark hair, middle-aged. He was wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform, but I'd never seen him before, and there was something wrong about him. Something off. The way he moved was too smooth, too deliberate, like he was performing instead of just walking. The same man Robert Paulson had described seeing during the renovation. the same figure captured in the reflection in the Polaroid. Sarah felt the pieces beginning to connect, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than she had anticipated. A predator who had intimate knowledge of the Desert Rose Hotel, who knew about the maintenance tunnels, the blind spots in the security coverage, the renovation plans that would provide the perfect opportunity to seal away evidence. Who had hunted 3 women in the corridors of that hotel, documented his crime, and then vanished back into whatever darkness had spawned him. As they left the care facility, Marcus voiced what Sarah was thinking. This wasn't opportunistic. He planned this. Maybe not those specific women, but he'd prepared that hotel as his hunting ground long before they checked in. Sarah gripped the key Eddie had given her, feeling its teeth bite into her palm. Which means there might be others. If he was comfortable enough to seal evidence in the walls, confident enough to photograph his work, he might have killed before. And if the bodies aren't with the belongings, then they're somewhere else in that building. "We need to search the maintenance tunnels," Marcus said. Sarah nodded, already pulling out her phone to call for a search warrant and a forensics team. But as she made the call, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something carefully prepared, something that had been waiting for them with the patience of a spider in its web. The Desert Rose Hotel had secrets in its bones, and the sum of those secrets, Sarah was beginning to realize, were very much alive. The Desert Rose Hotel looked different in daylight, its pink facade less romantic and more desperate, like an aging showgirl clinging to glory days that had never really existed. Sarah stood in what had once been the lobby, now stripped to bare concrete and exposed wiring, and felt the weight of the building's history pressing down on her. The forensics team had arrived at dawn, along with structural engineers who would ensure the maintenance tunnels were safe to enter. Marcus stood beside her, studying the building plans they had obtained from the city records office. The tunnels formed a network beneath the hotel, originally constructed in the 1980s to house the building's utilities and provide service access to each floor. "The main tunnel runs north to south," Marcus said, tracing the lines on the blueprint with his finger, with branches leading to each floor's service corridor. According to these plans, there are access points in the basement, on the 3rd floor, and on the roof for ventilation. Sarah watched the forensics team set up their equipment near the basement access door, the same door Eddie Frakes had found propped open 28 years ago. The door itself was rusted and heavy, its hinges protesting when 2 officers finally managed to pull it open. Beyond lay a darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. "We'll go in with full gear," the team leader, a woman named Rita Vasquez, announced. "Respirators, because God knows what's been decomposing down there for 3 decades. Full protective suits in case we encounter biological hazards, and we stay together. No one goes off alone." Sarah and Marcus suited up alongside the forensics team, the process familiar but no less uncomfortable. The respirator made breathing feel labored and artificial, and the protective suit trapped heat against her skin. But these precautions were necessary. If there were bodies in these tunnels, they would be in an advanced state of decomposition. The tunnel entrance was a concrete throat that descended at a steep angle into the earth. The air that rose from it was cold and stale, carrying scents of mold and something else, something organic and wrong. Sarah's flashlight beam revealed walls streaked with water damage and decades of grime. The concrete floor was uneven, cracked in places where the earth had shifted beneath. They moved forward in single file, Rita in the lead with her equipment, followed by 2 other technicians, then Sarah and Marcus bringing up the rear. The tunnel was narrow enough that Sarah's shoulders occasionally brushed the walls, leaving smears of dirt on her white protective suit. After 50 feet, the tunnel branched. The main corridor continued straight, while a narrower passage led off to the right. According to the blueprints, this branch provided access to the old boiler room and the electrical systems. "We'll search systematically," Rita said, her voice muffled by the respirator. "Main tunnel first, then we'll work through each branch. Everyone keep your cameras running. We document everything. The main tunnel stretched ahead into darkness that their lights couldn't fully penetrate. Sarah noticed that the walls here weren't just concrete. In places, the original builders had used brick, and the mortar between them had crumbled with age, leaving gaps that could hide almost anything. They had walked perhaps 200 feet when Rita suddenly stopped. She raised her hand, signaling the team to halt, and knelt down to examine something on the floor. Sarah moved closer and saw what had caught her attention. Scratches, deep gouges in the concrete, running parallel to each other, as if something with claws or fingernails had scraped across the floor with tremendous force. The marks were old, the edges softened by time, but their violence was unmistakable. "These continue," Rita said, following the scratches with her flashlight. They led deeper into the tunnel, becoming more frequent and more frantic. Sarah could picture someone being dragged, their hands scrabbling uselessly at the concrete, fighting against their captor with the desperation of the doomed. The tunnel opened into a wider space, a junction where multiple passages converged. And there, against the far wall, they found the first body. It wasn't one of the flight attendants. The remains were older, the bones yellowed and partially scattered. The clothing had mostly rotted away, but fragments remained, enough to see that this had been a woman. Her skeleton was positioned oddly, the arms extended above the head, the legs bent at unnatural angles. She was chained, Rita said, pointing to the rusted metal still encircling the bones of her wrists. "Shackled to the wall and left here." Marcus's voice was tight with horror. "How long has she been here?" Before the flight attendants, before 1996. This woman had died down here decades earlier, and no one had ever found her. No one had ever looked. They moved deeper into the tunnels, and the discoveries multiplied. Another set of remains in a side passage, these ones showing signs of trauma to the skull. A third body in what appeared to have been a storage room, the skeleton curled in a fetal position in the corner. "How many?" Sarah whispered, though she knew Rita couldn't answer. How many women had died in these tunnels? How many times had this predator hunted in the darkness beneath the Desert Rose Hotel? The tunnel that led to the third-floor service corridor was narrower than the others, barely wide enough for one person to pass through comfortably. The walls here were different, covered in something that Sarah initially thought was water damage. But when Rita shone her light directly on it, Sarah realized what she was seeing. Handprints, dozens of them, overlapping and smeared, covering the walls from floor to ceiling. Some were in rust-colored substances that might have been blood. Others were just impressions in the grime, as if countless hands had touched these walls, seeking escape that never came. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed. At the end of this tunnel, they found a room that didn't appear on any blueprints. Someone had carved it out of the earth behind the hotel's foundation, a space roughly 10 feet square with a ceiling so low they had to crouch to enter. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves were items that made Sarah's blood run cold. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned to boards and arranged in careful chronological order. Women's faces staring out from Polaroids and old film prints, some smiling at the camera, others showing expressions of terror. Jewelry arranged in small boxes, each piece labeled with a date and initials. Articles of clothing folded neatly and preserved in plastic bags. And at the center of it all, a journal. Its leather cover cracked with age, but its pages intact. Rita carefully bagged the journal as evidence, but not before Sarah glimpsed some of the entries. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, recording dates and times, methods and results. The clinical language of someone who viewed murder not as a crime, but as a science. "This is his trophy room," Rita said. "This is where he came to remember them." Sarah counted the photographs visible on the nearest board. 32 faces, 32 women who had crossed paths with the Desert Rose Hotel and never left. The 3 flight attendants were there, their official Western Airways photos pinned beside more candid shots taken in the hotel corridor. Images captured moments before their deaths. But it was the final board that made Sarah's hands shake. Recent photographs. Women who were still alive. Their images captured on digital prints rather than Polaroids. Hotel guests, staff members, women who had checked in and checked out safely, unaware that they had been selected, evaluated, and ultimately rejected by a predator who was still hunting. "He's still active," Sarah said, her voice barely audible through the respirator. "Whoever did this, he's still out there." Marcus was examining the dates on the most recent photographs. "These are from last year. He was here when the hotel was condemned, when it was supposed to be empty. He came back." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. A serial killer who had been operating for at least 4 decades, who had claimed at least 32 victims that they knew of, who had used the Desert Rose Hotel as his hunting ground and then simply vanished when the hotel closed. But he hadn't vanished completely. He had returned, checking on his collection, perhaps reliving his crimes in the darkness beneath a building that was scheduled for demolition. "We need to seal this entire area," Sarah said. "Full excavation of every tunnel, every room, and we need to identify every victim whose remains we've found. 32 women deserve to have their names back." As they made their way back through the tunnels, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The darkness beyond their flashlight beams seemed to press in on them, alive with malevolence. She kept glancing back, expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows, those dead black eyes watching their discovery with amusement. When they finally emerged into the daylight, Sarah tore off her respirator and breathed deeply, trying to clear her lungs of the stale, death-tainted air from below. Around her, the forensics team was setting up a perimeter, calling for additional support, beginning the massive undertaking of processing what was now clearly one of the largest crime scenes in Las Vegas history. Rita approached with the journal, now sealed in an evidence bag. "Detective Chen, you need to see this. The last entry." Sarah took the bag and read through the clear plastic. The entry was dated October 3rd, 2023. Less than a year ago. The handwriting was the same precise script as the earlier entries, but the message was different. Not a clinical record of a murder, but something else entirely. "They're tearing down my cathedral," it read. "After all these years, they finally decided to destroy the only place that ever understood me. But cathedrals aren't made of bricks and mortar. They're made of memory and sacrifice. The Desert Rose will fall, but what I built here will endure. I've made sure of that. The walls remember everything. The walls will tell." Sarah looked up at the condemned hotel, at its pink facade now swarming with police and forensics teams, at the windows like dark eyes staring back at her. The walls remember everything. What did that mean? What else was hidden in this building that they hadn't found yet? "Marcus," she said quietly, "we need to bring in ground-penetrating radar. We need to scan every wall, every floor, every foundation. If he sealed the flight attendants' belongings in the walls, there might be more. There might be bodies," Marcus finished. "You think he put bodies in the walls?" Sarah nodded, her stomach churning with the horror of it. The renovation in 1997 hadn't just been an opportunity to hide evidence. It had been an opportunity to entomb his victims in the very structure of the hotel, to make them a permanent part of his cathedral of death. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Sarah made the calls that would expand their investigation tenfold. By nightfall, the Desert Rose Hotel would be swarming with specialists, its every secret exposed to light and examination. And somewhere out there, she knew, a killer was watching, waiting to see if they would find what he had left for them. The walls remember everything, and Sarah Chen was going to make them speak. The ground-penetrating radar revealed what Sarah had feared. The walls of the Desert Rose Hotel were honeycombed with anomalies. Spaces that shouldn't exist according to the building plans. Voids that registered on the scans as dense masses that could be concrete, or steel, or something organic that had been sealed away for decades. The excavation began on the 3rd floor, where the flight attendants had last been seen. A structural engineer named David Kemp had identified the safest places to breach the walls without risking collapse. Sarah watched as his team carefully cut through the drywall in room 321, Kimberly Tate's room, peeling back layers of renovation and revealing what lay beneath. The smell hit them first. Even through respirators, the stench of decay was overwhelming, a miasma that seemed to have been compressed and aged like terrible wine. When the workers finally broke through to the sealed space, Sarah understood why. The cavity was roughly 3 feet wide and ran the entire length of the room. Inside were human remains, but not skeletonized as she had expected. The bodies had been preserved somehow, mummified by the dry desert air in the sealed environment, their features still partially recognizable despite the passage of time. Dr. Yun, who had been called to the scene, examined the remains with the careful attention she gave all the dead. "Female," she said, pointing to the first body. "Age approximately 20 to 30. Multiple fractures to the ribs and skull, suggesting blunt force trauma. Based on the clothing fragments and the level of preservation, I'd estimate death occurred sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. They found 6 more bodies in the walls of the 3rd floor alone. Each one had been positioned carefully, almost reverently, their hands folded across their chests, their faces cleaned and composed. It was a grotesque parody of a burial, these women entombed in the walls like saints in a crypt. But it was the wall between rooms 317 and 319 that yielded the discovery Sarah had been dreading. When the workers breached it, they found 3 bodies positioned side by side, their preservation better than the others because they had died more recently. 28 years ago, to be precise. Jessica Hartman, Denise Moreau, Kimberly Tate. Their bodies had been dressed in their flight attendant uniforms, their hair arranged neatly, their faces made up with what looked like stage makeup that had degraded over time. They looked like dolls, preserved and displayed by someone who had wanted to remember them exactly as they had been in life. Sarah stood in the hallway as the forensics team documented everything, photographed every detail, began the careful process of removing the bodies from their tombs. She should have felt triumph at solving a case that had haunted the department for nearly 3 decades. Instead, she felt only a profound sorrow for these women who had been so thoroughly objectified, even in death. Marcus approached, his face grim. The lab rushed the DNA results from the journal. They got a partial profile from skin cells on the pages. No match in any database, but they were able to extract enough genetic markers to do genealogical research. How long will that take? They're working on it now. But Sarah, there's something else. He held up a tablet showing a photograph from the journal, one they hadn't examined closely before. Look at this. It's dated 1983, one of the earliest entries. The photograph showed a young woman, maybe 18 or 19, sitting in what appeared to be the lobby of the Desert Rose Hotel. She was smiling at the camera, unaware that her image was being captured by her future killer. But it was the background that Marcus wanted her to see. Behind the young woman, partially visible in the reflection of a decorative mirror, was a figure, a man in a maintenance uniform, his face turned slightly away from the camera but still partially visible. Dark hair, thin build, tall frame. "The same man," Sarah said. "The one Robert and Eddie described. Now look at this." Marcus swiped to another image, this one more recent, extracted from the hotel's surveillance footage from 2023. It showed the condemned building's interior, supposedly empty. But there in the background, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure. The image quality was poor, degraded by the old security system, but the silhouette was unmistakable. "He's been coming back," Sarah said. Even after the hotel closed, even after it was condemned, he's been returning to visit his collection. Which means he might come back again, Marcus said. Especially now. He must know we found everything. He might want to see what we've uncovered, or he might want to stop us, Sarah finished. Her phone rang. It was Rita, calling from the basement where another team was continuing to excavate the maintenance tunnels. "Detective, you need to get down here. We found something in that trophy room, hidden behind the shelf of photographs." 5 minutes later, Sarah stood in the cramped underground space, staring at what Rita's team had discovered. Behind the wooden shelving unit, someone had carved words directly into the concrete wall. The letters were deep and precise, carved with what must have been a chisel or similar tool, the work of days or perhaps weeks. "They asked to stay," the first line read. "They begged to be remembered. I gave them immortality." Below this were names, dozens of them, carved in chronological order, each one followed by a date. Sarah recognized some from the missing persons reports she had been reviewing. Others were names she didn't know, women who might never have been reported missing, whose absences had been noted by no one. At the bottom of the list, carved more recently based on the cleaner edges of the letters, were 3 names that made Sarah's blood run cold. Jessica Hartman, September 16, 1996. Denise Moreau, September 16, 1996. Kimberly Tate, September 16, 1996. And below them, separated by a gap that suggested time had passed, was a single line carved in fresh concrete, the dust from the carving still visible on the floor beneath. "The ones who seek the truth will join the chorus. The walls hunger still." "He was here," Sarah said, her voice tight. "Recently, after we found the evidence behind the 3rd-floor wall, he came back to leave us a message." Rita nodded grimly. "The concrete dust is still settling. Based on how fresh it is, I'd say this was carved within the last 48 hours. He's been watching the excavation." Marcus pulled out his radio. "We need to review all the security footage from the demolition site. Every camera, every angle. He's been here, which means he's on tape somewhere." But Sarah was thinking about something else. "The ones who seek the truth will join the chorus." It wasn't just a taunt. It was a threat. The killer was aware of their investigation, aware of her specifically, and he was promising that she would join his collection, become another name carved in his wall. They worked through the night, reviewing security footage from the demolition site cameras, from traffic cameras on nearby streets, from every possible angle that might have captured the killer's return to his hunting ground. And finally, at 3 in the morning, they found him. The footage was from a camera positioned across the street from the Desert Rose, capturing the hotel's eastern side. At 1:47 a.m. 2 nights ago, a figure could be seen entering through a gap in the construction fencing. He moved with confidence, someone familiar with the building's layout, someone who knew exactly where the cameras were positioned and how to avoid them. But this camera had been recently installed by the demolition company, and he hadn't known about it. For just a few seconds, as he crossed from shadow to shadow, his face was illuminated by a security light. Sarah froze the frame and enhanced the image. The man was in his 60s, with dark hair gone gray at the temples, a thin build, and those same dead black eyes that witnesses had described. He wore dark clothing and moved with an economy of motion that suggested either military training or long practice in moving unseen. "Run facial recognition," Sarah ordered. "Compare it against every database we have access to. DMV records, employment records, military databases. Someone knows who this man is." While the search ran, Sarah studied the frozen image, memorizing every detail of the face that had haunted the Desert Rose Hotel for over 40 years. He looked ordinary, the kind of man who would blend into any crowd, who could work in maintenance or security or any job that required being present but unnoticed. The facial recognition software chimed. One match with a 73% confidence level. The name on the screen made Sarah's stomach drop. Thomas Ray Carver, born 1962, son of Raymond Carver, who had owned the Desert Rose Hotel from 1989 to 2003. But Thomas Ray Carver was supposed to be dead. According to the records Sarah pulled up, he had died in a construction accident in 1995, crushed by a falling beam while working on a renovation project. There had been a death certificate, a cremation, a memorial service. "It's fake," Sarah said, her mind racing. He faked his death. His father owned the hotel. Thomas would have had complete access, would have known every inch of the building, would have been able to come and go without anyone questioning his presence. Marcus was already pulling up everything they had on the Carver family. Raymond Carver bought the Desert Rose in 1989, but there's no record of Thomas working there officially, no employment records, no tax documents. It's like he was a ghost even before he supposedly died. Because his father was covering for him, Sarah said. Raymond knew what his son was doing in that hotel. Maybe he didn't know the full extent, but he knew enough to protect him, to look the other way, to facilitate the renovation that sealed the evidence away. She thought about the timeline. Thomas had supposedly died in 1995, a year before the flight attendants disappeared. But if he had faked his death, he would have been free to move without the scrutiny of employment records or tax documents. He could have continued his hunting in perfect anonymity, protected by the fiction of his death. And when Raymond Carver died in 2003, Thomas would have lost his protector, would have had to be more careful, more selective. But he had never stopped. The recent photographs in his trophy room proved that. He had continued killing, continued collecting, continued feeding the hunger that drove him. "We need to find where he's living now," Sarah said. "He can't be staying in the hotel anymore, not with the demolition crews there during the day. But he's close. He's been watching us, and you can't watch from a distance in this city. He's somewhere nearby." As dawn broke over Las Vegas, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink, Sarah stood outside the Desert Rose Hotel and looked up at its facade. In a few weeks, it would be gone, reduced to rubble and hauled away. But the memory of what had happened here would endure, carved into the walls and into the lives of everyone who had been touched by Thomas Ray Carver's madness. "The walls hunger still," he had written. But Sarah Chen was going to make sure that hunger was never fed again. The genealogical DNA search came back at dawn. Thomas Ray Carver had a living relative, a half-sister named Patricia Brennan who lived in Henderson. She had submitted her DNA to her ancestry database 5 years ago, never imagining it would help identify a serial killer. Patricia agreed to meet them at the police station, her face pale with shock when Sarah explained why they needed to speak with her. She was in her 50s, the elementary school teacher with kind eyes that seemed incapable of hiding anything. "I never knew I had a half-brother until my mother died," Patricia said, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold. "She told me on her deathbed, said my father had another child from a previous relationship, a son named Thomas. But she also said Thomas was dead, that he died in an accident before I was born." "Your mother lied to protect you," Sarah said gently. "Thomas is very much alive, and we believe he's killed at least 32 women over the past 4 decades. Patricia's cup clattered against the table. "That's not possible. My mother said he was troubled, that he'd had a difficult childhood, but she never suggested anything like this." Marcus pulled out a photograph, the enhanced image from the security footage. "Ms. Brennan, is this your half-brother?" Patricia stared at the image for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I saw him once, 3 years ago. He showed up at my house one evening, said he was Thomas, that we were family. I didn't believe him at first, but he knew things, details about my father that only family would know." She paused, her voice dropping. "He scared me. The way he looked at me, it was like he was studying an insect. After an hour, he left, and I never saw him again. But he left an address, said if I ever wanted to connect his family, I could find him there." Sarah's pulse quickened. Do you still have that address? Patricia pulled out her phone and scrolled through her notes. I kept it, though I never had any intention of visiting. It was an apartment complex off Boulder Highway, Unit 247. Within the hour, Sarah, Marcus, and a SWAT team surrounded the Sunset Vista Apartments, a decrepit building that catered to transients and those who didn't want questions asked. The manager confirmed that Unit 247 was rented to a Thomas Black, a quiet tenant who paid in cash and was rarely seen. The apartment was on the second floor, its windows covered with thick curtains that allowed no light to escape. Sarah positioned herself with the SWAT team, her weapon drawn, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was the moment they had been working toward, the culmination of 28 years of unanswered questions. The team breached the door with practiced efficiency, flowing into the apartment with tactical precision. Sarah followed, her senses heightened, prepared for resistance, for violence, for anything. But the apartment was empty, not just unoccupied, deliberately emptied. The furniture remained, but every personal item had been removed. No photographs, no clothing, no evidence that anyone had lived here at all. Except for one thing. On the wall facing the door, written in what appeared to be red paint, was a message. "Detective Chen, I've been watching you watch me." The game was entertaining while it lasted, but cathedrals fall and new ones must be built. Find me if you can. The walls in other places hunger too. Sarah felt her blood run cold. He had known they were coming. Had known they would find Patricia, would find this address. He had stayed one step ahead, and now he was gone, vanished into the sprawl of Las Vegas or beyond. Marcus approached the message, studying it carefully. "Sarah, this isn't paint." Dr. Yun, who had accompanied them, pulled out a testing kit and took a sample. Her face went pale. "It's blood, fresh, no more than a few hours old." "His own?" Sarah asked. "I'll need to test it, but given the volume and the fact that there's no sign of distress in the apartment, I'd say this came from someone else." Dr. Yun's voice was tight. "Someone who was here recently." The forensics team swept the apartment, finding more than Sarah had initially thought. In the closet, they discovered a laptop, its hard drive deliberately corrupted but potentially recoverable. In the bathroom, hidden behind a loose tile, they found a small notebook containing addresses, dozens of them, scattered across the western United States. Hotels mostly, small establishments in cities that attracted transients and tourists. "He's been traveling," Marcus said, studying the notebook, "using different hunting grounds. The Desert Rose was just one of many." Sarah made the calls that would alert law enforcement agencies across multiple states, sending out Thomas Ray Carver's photograph and description, warning them that a serial killer was potentially active in their jurisdictions. But even as she coordinated the response, she knew the truth. Thomas Ray Carver had been killing for over 40 years, had survived discovery and investigation, had built and abandoned multiple hunting grounds. He was intelligent, patient, and most terrifyingly, he was adaptable. The Desert Rose had been his cathedral, but he had always known it would eventually fall. He had prepared for this moment. The laptop was taken to the department's cyber crimes unit, where technicians worked through the night to recover data from the damaged hard drive. What they found was a digital archive of horror, thousands of photographs, videos documenting murders going back decades, meticulous records of victims and locations. But more disturbing was the folder labeled Future. It contained surveillance photographs taken within the past month. Women in airports, in hotel lobbies, on city streets. Potential victims, already selected, already being studied. And among these photographs was one that made Sarah's hands shake. It was a photo of her, taken 3 days ago as she left the police station. The angles suggested it had been shot from a vehicle parked across the street. Thomas Ray Carver had been watching her just as closely as she had been hunting him. The image was time-stamped and tagged with a single word. Worthy. Sarah stared at her own image. at the designation that marked her as something more than just an investigator. In Thomas Ray Carver's twisted psychology, she had become interesting to him, had proven herself through her pursuit, had earned his attention in a way that transcended the hunter-prey relationship. "He's going to come after you," Marcus said quietly, voicing what Sarah already knew. "Not now, maybe not for months or years, but eventually he'll try to add you to his collection." Sarah thought about the women sealed in the walls of the Desert Rose, about their families who had waited decades for answers, about the lives stolen and the futures erased. She thought about the weight of this case, the way it had already changed her, the way it would continue to haunt her dreams. "Let him try," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Because I'll be ready, and I'll spend every day between now and then making sure he has nowhere left to hide." The search for Thomas Ray Carver expanded, became a multi-agency manhunt that stretched across state lines. His face appeared on wanted posters and news broadcasts. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit built a profile, predicting his next moves, his potential targets. But weeks passed with no confirmed sightings, no credible leads. He had disappeared into America's vast spaces, into the anonymous crowds of its cities, into the network of transient housing and cash transactions that allowed people to live ghost-like existences. But Sarah knew he was still out there, still hunting, still building new cathedrals to his twisted faith. The Desert Rose Hotel came down on a cold November morning. Sarah watched from a distance as the demolition charges detonated, watched the building collapse in on itself, watched 40 years of secrets and suffering reduced to a cloud of dust that drifted across the desert. The families of the 32 identified victims had been notified, had been given the closure they deserved. Memorial services were planned. The dead would finally rest. But for Sarah Chen, there was no rest. Every hotel she passed, every maintenance worker she saw, every shadow that moved wrong in her peripheral vision brought a spike of adrenaline, a reminder that Thomas Ray Carver was still free, still watching, still waiting for his moment. "The walls hunger still," he had written. And somewhere in America, in some hotel or apartment or anonymous building, those walls were being fed. Sarah could feel it with a certainty that went beyond evidence and logic, a cold knowledge that settled in her bones and refused to leave. She had solved the case of the 3 vanishing flight attendants, but in doing so she had awakened something that had been content to hide in the shadows. Now it was loose in the world, aware of her, interested in her, and patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah Chen had found her cathedral. Now she would spend the rest of her life making sure no one else was sacrificed within its walls. Sarah started her car and drove toward the airport, toward Reno, toward the next lead in an investigation that had consumed her life. Behind her, the city of Las Vegas glittered in the desert sun, full of hotels and transient souls, full of places where predators could hide and hunt and feed the walls that hungered for sacrifice. But now, those walls had a guardian, and Detective Sarah Chen would make sure they were never fed again.